Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. Where I can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 166 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, and today's episode is on when do defense mechanisms interfere with therapy. So today's episode is a really good one that focuses on the defense mechanisms that we have, and these are perfectly natural to have because we all have them. Protect us from uncomfortable situations, feelings and emotions, but sometimes they do interfere with therapy for both the client and the psychotherapist. So that's what we're going to focus on today, though, to try and see what are they and what are the type of defense mechanisms that cause us so many problems when it comes to therapy. And it is Friday the 19th of August 2022 as I record this. So we're moving on to the psychology news section, reviewing from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is, here are the benefits and downsides of being extroverted. As we're such a asocial species, it's no wonder that we prize extroversion. In fact, according to a UK study that hit headlines at the Times, new mothers put extroversion above even intelligence and conscientiousness on their list of most wanted traits in their children. But is this personality trait really all well cracked up to be? And then what this article then that goes on to talk about is the benefit. For example, it does tend to give people a better advantage at work, as supported by a 2018 meta-analysis. But as we've covered before, extroversion does tend to mean that you don't listen as well as introverts, and most importantly, people don't trust you as much as introverts. So that's really interesting and really important, to be honest, though. So, but then I guess the only takeaway from that psychology news article is basically twofold. One, if you're extroverted, just to know that it's not exactly perfect, and if you do find yourself being introverted at times, then that's okay too. And then the second takeaway, though, is that if you're introverted yourself, then just to know that there are benefits, a benefit to it, and you aren't a bad person for not being extroverted, I'm sure that some people would like you to believe. So the second one is, good self-control can both help and hinder attempts to move on after a failure. People spend a lot of time thinking about how to achieve their goals, big or small, with thousands of articles, books, podcasts, and other media published every year on the subject. Unfortunately, striving for our goals also sometimes results in a failure, and in the face of defeat, we often need to adjust our goals and strive towards something more attainable. Now, a study in motivation and emotion has found that those who are prone to boredom are less likely to re-engage with newer goals, and having good self-control can be a barrier to moving on from the original goals set in the first place. Okay, so there's actually quite a few things though to actually take away from this article, though. If we're opposed to boredom, then that's actually really important to actually recognise and to try to overcome it, because if you get bored with certain goals easily, then you're never going to try them, and then you're actually never going to engage with them. But then if you have some self-control, then you can easily get over the boredom, and then hopefully you can then achieve your goals. But when it comes to too much self-control, what this article is actually talking is that if you set yourself an impossible goal, then the most logical thing you have to do would be to either change it, readapt it, just so it's more attainable. But if you have too much self-control, then now that becomes a lot harder. Of course, that you're not willing to change it. So just something to bear in mind for all of us. And the last one is, being politically conservative doesn't lead to greater happiness. Repeated studies have found that conservatives are happier than liberals and report more life satisfaction and better health. Why might this be? Perhaps the conservatives are more likely to believe that society is generally fairer. And I'm sorry, I don't care what your political orientation is. That's funny. Um, just the idea that society's fair. That's funny. And so feel less anxious about inequalities. Perhaps it's down to differences in personality traits. At least one study has found that conservatives also feel they have more control over their lives, which is linked to greater well-being. Whatever the exact mechanism, write the new authors of a new paper in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. Most of the studies in this area share the same unevidenced assumption that being drives their greater well-being rather than the other way around. Now where they report results from 2 longitudinal studies that explore this assumption, their findings challenge some fundamental ideas in this field. So I'm not going to go into the deep details of this article though, and I'm not going to go into anything too political. But this is quite interesting to read about because, of course, there really is nothing I can say about going in that politics. But it's always good that we're challenging and what we're finding or what assumptions are based on evidence and which are not. And if we find out assumptions that are not based on evidence, then it is absolutely a critical, for the sake of psychology, that we do decide to research it, to prove it, and that is absolutely critical in any science. So I really hope that you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. This week I've been doing a lot of different things, but I've also been doing a lot of psychology based stuff though. But because I had a meeting on Monday with my dissertation supervisor and one of his PhD students and other students who will also be doing the final year project with me there, because we're all doing the same basic experiment, but we're all doing different variations on it. For example, I'm doing EEG based. One of them's doing the online based version, and then the other one I completely forget. But the meeting itself was really interesting though. And then next Monday, we're going to have a meeting about the literature of them. So I've been going through with that. And it really is interesting to read about stuff like the brain oscillations, also known as brave waves to the rest of us. Yes, brain oscillations, theta, alpha. What other ones have I been reading about? Yes, and then I've also been reading stuff about Saf Maths, which is the more scientific version of flashcards. So that's the easiest way to explain that. So it's been a very busy week though, and I am looking forward to my final year at university. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can also always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Clinical Psychology Reflections. So originally I actually couldn't decide what the sponsored product for today's episode would be there. Okay, now what was the choices were clinical psychology, formulation in psychotherapy, and abnormal psychology. But I actually couldn't decide between them. But then I remembered that there's an absolute brilliant collection which actually contains all 3 books. So this is an absolute brilliant collection which not only saves you money though, but it also contains all 3 great, really easy to understand books. For example, clinical psychology. It's a brilliant book that actually lays down the basics of what clinical psychology is, what does it cover, and then it also goes into tons of details. So if you want to learn more about clinical psychology, then definitely get that great book. Whereas formulation in psychotherapy actually dives a bit more deeper into a specific area of clinical psychology that focuses on tailor-made psychotherapy for the individual, and this is absolutely a critical work for the future of mental health. So I really do recommend it. And then finally, abnormal psychology. Psychology is a great, easy to understand book that looks at the causes and treatments of the depression, anxiety, and so many more great topics. So if you want an outstanding guide to these areas, then definitely check out Clinical Psychology Reflections. Available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get the paperback and hardback copy from Amazon, your local bookstore, or local library if you request it. And you can also buy it directly from me at payhip.com/Conwhiteley. But if you didn't want to buy a book, but you still wanted to give the podcast a bit of one-time support, then you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Conwhiteley. So let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about when do defense mechanisms interfere with therapy. Well, therapy though, and as I mentioned before, though, the reason why I actually wanted to do today's episode was because we all have defense mechanisms, and 9 times out of 10 they're actually really helpful to us. So, but the problem with mental health difficulties is that these behaviours are actually maladaptive coping mechanisms that were. So, but this sort of falls under the same vein though, and that's why I really want to focus on it. So, let's dive into it. What are defense mechanisms? Our defense mechanisms can activate at any moment when we feel challenged, or maybe when someone has hit a nerve by speaking a truth that we aren't comfortable hearing or dealing with in our lives. As well as another definition is that defense mechanisms are unconscious thoughts that trigger certain reactions and behaviors so we can avoid uncomfortable situations, emotions and feelings. In terms of psychotherapy, both the therapist or client could be triggered by a non-verbal cue that could be misleading or by something that is said in the session. And it's important to note that within psychotherapy, all emotions are valid, and of course, it is just critical that we never judge others for having a reaction, because that is a human. I'm sure certain therapeutic models would disagree, but the truth is it is a human to react. An example of this is how therapists wish to simply forget about something that was said in the therapy room, because this might have struck too close to home or hit a nerve. In addition, it is absolutely not the job of our client to make sure that we aren't triggered because they are there for psychotherapy and they need to reveal things to us regardless of its nature. But we're all bound to have experiences at times that make us react because we're human. Additionally, one of the most important factors when it comes to defense mechanisms is that there is an intimacy that exists between us as future or current psychologists and our clients, since we are just two people in a room trying to make the best use of our language skills to deepen an interpersonal relationship in an effort for the psychologist to help the client. As well as it is a great reminder that this is very awkward at first and rather intimidating, resulting in an increase in vulnerability from the client because they are having to share deeply personal things with us. So this is a perfect catalyst for a defense mechanism to activate because the client doesn't feel safe and secure. Thankfully, this is typically overcome after a while because the therapist manages to build a rapport with the client, and the therapeutic relationship increases, making the client feel safe and secure in the therapeutic environment that is client-centered. However, there tends to be 3 defense mechanisms that pop up a lot of the time, and these can be important to discuss and explore with a client. As well as not only will knowing about these mechanisms help you help your own understanding, but it will also enhance your own self-awareness of these unconscious biases, feelings and triggers that might arise in our lives outside of the therapy room. Defense mechanism of dissociation. Our first defense mechanism is a dissociation. That is when people become mentally and emotionally disconnected from their lives, trauma and stressful situations. With the degree of their dissociation is different for everyone, depending on if the person has healthy coping mechanisms that allows them to come back to the present to see their current reality from a positive perspective. This is a defense mechanism because it allows clients to not remember certain events that cause them distress. Defense mechanisms of denial. People aren't strangers to denial because it can be helpful in situations where people feel like things are outside of their control, or as a response to when we feel the truth we are trying not to tell others isn't being heard or supported. Although denial can be a positive mechanism too. For instance, if a client who is optimistic about their loved ones recovering from a car accident or surgery, then this denial can be helpful in finding hope in certain situations. On the other hand, denial can cause people to not pay attention to any warning signs, so that something in their lives needs addressing for the sake of their mental health. For example, if they're starting to develop an addiction, but has ignored the warning signs, such as if they have an addiction but is able to go about their daily lives without any disruptions, then it could be harder for them to face that there's a problem, and they will be unlikely to accept how it affects their lives as well as how it affects those that care and love them. Defense mechanism of intellectualization, and that is a big word, and that is a big word to try and say on a podcast. Finally, intellectualization is a defense mechanism that those a person are using reasoning, analytical thinking, and logic to avoid anxiety-provoking and uncomfortable emotions. Intellectualization can actually be very useful in helping a person rationalize behavior and analyze events. For example, if a co-worker had been acting strange after a conversation that you overheard, then intellectualization could allow you to deduce that they're annoyed, and you could deduce that the conversation caused them to be annoyed. However, the problem with intellectualization is that it could lead you to downplay the importance of the person's underlying reason or feelings of being upset. Due to in our society, we often tend to label behaviours as acceptable or not. And if we take an example, then our childhood experiences can determine our opinions on the acceptable reaction to anger. For example, people from minority groups have reported that they don't like talking about their feelings to people with privilege in their society, so they downplay their feelings in order to be heard. Conclusion. Linking this all to therapy now. It doesn't actually matter what the trigger is, be it verbal or non-verbal, in our own lives or outside the therapy session itself. We owe it to all of us to create a therapy space where everyone can communicate to the best of their abilities. And of course, the defense mechanisms for the client and the therapist will be activated at times. And this is normal. But the first step to normalizing these mechanisms is to accept that they are there in the first place, and we should be aware of hierarchical systems of power, like I've spoken about and written about before. These hierarchical systems could cause us all to be biased about a person's lived experience, and as current or future therapists, that is something we must absolutely avoid at all costs. As well as this is why communication is so critical in psychotherapy. It allows us to support our clients and make them so sure that we are on their side without judgment, and we will always support them with acceptance and compassion, because that is what we look for as an amazing therapist, and we always act in the best interest of our clients. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you got something out of it. Well, I know that I definitely did though, and I always do like looking at these clinical psychology topics. So if you know someone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help us spread the words about the podcast. And definitely check out Clinical Psychology Collection. It's a great free book box set that I cannot recommend enough. Available in all the usual places. And you can buy it directly from me at payhips.com/ConWhiteley. But if you don't want to buy a book, but you still want to get the podcast a bit like one-time support, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ConWhiteley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.